Hello everyone. I wanted to take some time and talk about why I think civic nationalism ultimately will fail in the long run and why we want to avoid this. This is coming from the perspective of someone who is generally an ethno-nationalist of some kind, and I'll talk more about that later. But first we need to talk about some history and the reason why we form these types of societies in the first place. And really, when it gets down to it, you see that the state is really an expansion or an ultimate form of tribalism, and I'll explain why. In the earliest days of humanity, our tribal societies came together with those who were very strong and powerful and collected a certain amount of resources, and those who were willing to give up some of their naturally given freedoms came together and would be ruled by this person who had lots of resources. So in exchange for freedom, you got a little bit of security. And over time, as these societies grow and grow and grow, and you develop culture and writing and religion and things like this, the nature of the state changes. So we have tribal societies, we have the city, we have the city-state, we have the nation and the nation-state, and eventually we have the international type of world powers that we see today. But the reason why we've organized like this is it's an evolutionary strategy. It's more productive for humans based on how we are biologically to work together with one another in collective groups, because it's stronger than if we worked as individuals. For example, the reason why we have one man and one woman and they come together and create a child is because it's easier for there to be one person to look after the child and one person to go and provide resources for the family. It would not be possible for one human being to impregnate itself, carry the child to term, and then raise the child while at the same time going off into the woods and hunting boars or whatever they need to do. It's simply not feasible. It's more productive if we work together. And this is essentially why we have governments at all. It's because these collective forces can safeguard our populations from outside negative forces much easier than if an individual was, well, an individual on their own, let's say out in the woods. So now we can say that the state was created in order to provide stability for a certain population of people. And we haven't defined what that population is yet, but keep in mind the entire reason why I think that we have a state at all is for stability's sake, that it provides us a general amount of securities in order to ensure our survival on this planet. So the next question in politics is usually, what type of state can we create and maintain that will be stable over long periods of time? And historically, it would appear that authoritarian nations have been the most quote-unquote stable. Of course, we're not taking into account wars and human nature and things like that. It just appears that we've always had some type of authoritarian state that has lasted or has managed to last several thousand years. And it has only been recently that we've developed democracy and things like that. And I think perhaps subconsciously it was always the goal of people to have a state that was as stable as possible. I mean, if you look at the reason why humans have these sort of social norms, why we have certain moral and ethical thoughts in our heads, is really to promote stability. Because let's say within the city-state, you have one language, one religion, one group of one value set of ethics. What this does is that it reduces the amount of variables when it comes to interpersonal relationships between humans. You no longer have to go outside of your house and then peek around your shoulder every time you're walking down the street. You never have to worry about someone stabbing you in the back, per se, because everyone is unified within these values. Now, of course, I'm not going to deny reality here and say that no one ever got stabbed in the back, but it was a lot easier for people on their minds to know that everyone sort of shared the similar values. There was never any miscommunications because everyone spoke sort of the same language. They all had the same kind of cultural heritage. There was much less confusion. It was much more stable over time. And this stability allowed us to create these very high empathy, high trust societies, especially in places like the Scandinavian countries. They have very high trust societies, or well, they did, but this is in the promotion of stability of their society. It allows their group of people to survive long periods of time. So now we get to the question of civic nationalism. What does it promote? Does it promote stability? And through all of the discussions I've had with civic nationalists, it does not promote enough stability because it does not reduce the factors in which humans fight one another. Because as we know, historically, one of the worst types of conflicts is a conflict among ethnic lines or racial lines or religious lines. And this sort of civic nationalist, well, everyone's a citizen, sort of, I hate to use the magic soil argument, but it's true. People don't just drop their identities unless it's, forcefully taken from them, as was in sort of the United States in the pre-1960s immigration era, where it was essentially, hey, you can come here if you're a white Western European, but you may be able to keep your religion. However, there are some social norms. You have to learn the language, you have to get a job, this and that. And we are not afraid to deport your ass for any reason that we see fit. It's that sort of heavy-handedness. And I've never met a civic nationalist that was so heavy-handed with their immigration policies. It was always, if people are already here, they already have been granted rights, we cannot remove them from society. Even in the name, as I've pointed out, even in the name of promoting stability within your own native population. Now, when you compound that with the fact that many of these civic nationalists are not authoritarians, they're either libertarian or some kind of republicanist, or someone who is vaguely in favor of some kind of representative or constitutional democracy. Now the issue gets even worse, because now we have large populations that can vote in their favor. So now if you introduce racial conflict into a situation where you as a group are able to collectively vote in blocks, you're going to have even more racial struggle, as we have seen in this sort of civic nationalist experiment within the past 100 years in the United States and Western Europe. You have these very objective, concrete voting blocks of people who vote within their interest for their group for whatever reason. I'm not going to prescribe a reason why they vote amongst racial lines, they just seem to do so. Even if you say that, well, it's just culture, we need higher intelligence, so on and so forth, there are places with high intelligent people with a specific culture who still racially segregate themselves, even within the United States. Even in the most liberal white societies, they still segregate themselves amongst racial lines. It may be subconscious, but they still do it regardless. So that argument kind of falls on its face there. So we have these different voting blocks amongst racial, ethnic, or religious lines, all clumped together into one nation. Eventually you're going to get some sort of conflict. It's absolutely inevitable that you will have conflict amongst these. And this is, I'm reasoning this through historical evidence. Even in places where the national identity, you could call it, was very strong. Places like in the Roman Empire, for example. Even they succumbed to the plight of the civic nationalists, where they had an outside group with high in-group preference come in, ransack the place, and eventually the empire broke off. One of the strongest, most powerful, most technologically advanced empires of all time broke up because of this sort of multicultural experiment. And if we want to look more recently, we can look at the downfall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It started in 1868 after an agreement between the Habsburgs and the Hungarian monarchy. And eventually, this sort of multicultural experiment in the sort of Central Europe and Balkans area ended up causing World War I. Essentially, you had a pan-German movement in Austria and a pan-Slavic movement, and they constantly fought against one another. And the pan-Slavic movement eventually ended up killing Franz Ferdinand, which sparked a long and bloody conflict that set the stage for World War II, which caused even more economic destruction and bloodshed and violence and all of the other horrible things. So this is more historical evidence that you cannot combine two different racial groups with strong identities together in one place and throw in a democracy or even an authoritarian state and have it work out. They will always divide themselves, even subconsciously, amongst racial lines, and they will bring in more conflict than should be necessary. Now, is the solution ethno-nationalism? Perhaps. Is the solution authoritarianism? Perhaps. Is the solution democracy? Absolutely not. It certainly is not democracy. And if anyone thinks that it's possible to have different groups of people within a nation that have different intelligence levels, different cultures, different languages, different religions, that they're somehow going to come together and unite under one national identity, you're out of your mind. It's going to pull the nation apart, and then you will be a failure. It will be another failed experiment in multiculturalism, in civic nationalism, and in democracy. How long until people understand this? And I'm not going to sit here and say that, oh, I have the solution, put me in power, or here's the solution, it's right here in this book. I can't say that, but what I can say for certain is that there are issues within the civic nationalist movement that have not been addressed, will not be addressed, or are fundamental to the philosophy of this political movement. Well, I'm beginning to run out of time. I could go into more historical examples of why this fails and maybe a little bit more theoretical thinking, but I think we're going to end it there. Thank you for listening.